With this, I'd like to introduce Dr. Julia Vogel. Many of you might know her. She's an expert in the German Environment Agency and co-author of the paper on chemical recycling, which was published this year. I see her on the screen. I hope you can hear us. Okay. So she will talk about pending questions of the German Environmental Agency about the environmental aspects of ChemCycling. So please get started. You have 15 minutes and maybe there are questions.
Yes, thank you very much for the possibility and opportunity to also show you the position on the German Environment Agency on recycling. So can you please switch to the next chart? Okay. I don't know how it works with the slides. Could you please show me the next slide? Okay, good. So the question is actually, why is the German Environment Agency intensively dealing with chemical recycling at all? And I'm giving you a short selection of press headlines and articles, and you can see it was quite a few, and that was only a fraction of what I've seen on the last 18 months on chemical recycling. And many companies have announced to do something about it, to do something here and be active. And then, of course, there are questions like, is it the perfect recycling compared to what we already have? Or is it maybe the silver bullet in our fight against plastic waste? And next slide, please. Okay, so and then we wrote a background paper on that, and you mentioned it just before, on chemical recycling. It was published in July, and we tried to show there how we see the situation just now, and I would like to stress that it is just a momentary snapshot, so to speak, and I think a lot is happening here at the moment, and certainly it has to be a living document which will change in the course of time with all the new findings. Next slide, please. Okay, and so what is chemical recycling at all? It is a question which is being asked time and again. And I think the previous speaker already mentioned it, that the terminology maybe is not always the same. And that is because there is no real legal definition on chemical recycling yet, and I chose two. One comes from the European Coalition for Chemical Recycling that says that chemical recycling is defined as any reprocessing technology that directly affects either the formulation of the polymeric waste or the polymer itself and converts them into chemical substances and/or products, whether for the original or other purposes. But, and that's very important, the energy recovery is excluded from this definition. And a similar definition was written in the German Environment Agency in a research project, which is not final yet, but I would like to introduce it to you. We too tend to saying that chemical recycling relates to processes in which polymers, in part or wholly, are separated in their components, which then again are used to form new polymers or new other products. And here too, the energy recovery is excluded too. Not the energy recovery directly, I mean, that's not the part of it anyway, but the energy recovery of products. For example, producing fuel for us is not part of chemical recycling. Next slide, please. Here is, well, the plastic life cycle, so to speak, and also from the project that I already mentioned. And very clearly you can see the chain at the top coming from crude oil, certain steps of processing to plastic granulates or precursors, and then some products which then again form plastic waste. And the upper block shows the material recycling or the reuse already, which is the standard for plastic recycling just now. And the blue block shows the chemical recycling technologies like, for example, solvolysis, depolymerization, and pyrolysis, and gasification, which again then these products are fed into the plastic cycle. And the question is, and that is the dotted part on this picture, we have the energetic recovery of plastics, and if you look at it more closely and add an analysis, then it means that maybe you re-enter the plastic cycle. So in the discussion, it could also be called chemical recycling as such. So not energy recovery as such, but the CCU technologies. And I think a lot of discussion is still necessary on that, but it is an exciting part of the discussion to lead. And it certainly also depends on what is technically feasible and what makes sense. Okay, on this slide you see which input there might be for chemical recycling. There are different approaches, and there are also controversies to see what can be used. And I used a few pictures of plastic waste or waste in general. And of course, I believe that we all agree that the pure fractions, or the monofractions maybe, are not the adequate input stream for chemical recycling, because it can also be recycled elsewhere. And then you can see where to start. It also depends on the technology used, I would say, how unpure the waste can be. Some say that, for example, maritime litter, it could be used, but maybe it's also an approach for the solid waste fractions. And maybe we can also use the waste as it is and then make something useful with chemical recycling. Whether this is the truth or whether it works, we'll have to wait and see, because we don't have a final assessment on that yet. Next, please. On this picture, you can see how plastic waste has developed over the last decade, or the last 20 years even. You can see that plastic waste as such have increased, have become much more. And you can see that the mechanical solid recycling has already proceeded very much, and we have slightly below 50% material or mechanical recycling, but more than 50% of the waste still go into thermal disposal or energetic recovery. And here what we want to see, or we believe that it doesn't make ecological sense to be a competitor of mechanical recycling, but we should concentrate on that kind of waste which are now being incinerated. And here chemical recycling can take its share or make its contribution to improve plastic recycling and also to just change the situation as such. So the small blue part of 0.8%, that's what is being used in terms of chemical recycling. And of course, there's room for improvement here. So the question is really, is chemical recycling really the silver bullet? And my answer would be no, probably not, but you can see quite clearly that chemical recycling is on the upswing and many people are dealing with this technology. And I believe that, well, there is room for improvement. And now from the point of view of environment politics, there are still a few open questions, and I believe they are worthwhile being looked at in more detail and of being discussed and not just forgotten. And now the next slide. The most important question is really which are suitable techniques. And I said before that basically all techniques like pyrolysis and depolymerization are technically feasible, but whether in combination with the input materials, and that's the other question, which are sensible input materials, how can they be combined with the technologies available? So here, actually, we are still at the beginning of the discussion, and for us it is really important to say we do not want to step into competition with existing recycling methods, but we want to offer a complementation of the facets. And this again depends on the input. We want to make sure or show that they have ecological advantages over the material recycling, but also over energy recovery. It doesn't always make sense to have material recycling or mechanical recycling if and when in the end there are no ecological advantages in total. So you have to have a look at the entire picture. That's our point of view. And then, of course, there's the question of profitability. For the ecological assessment, it's not so relevant, but eventually for the processes and how they are then players on the market, that's, of course, a relevant question. Once all these questions are answered, we will have the political assessment of chemical recycling, and then we will be able to say what will be the effect on the rates and shares of the waste which can be recycled, where can we do it and where can't we do it, and we laid that down in our paper too. And in order to have a final assessment, certain questions will have to be still answered. And in order not to leave the answering of the questions to others, we have started a research project that was started in May this year. And here we're talking about assessment of the potentials and evaluation of the techniques of thermochemical plastics recycling. And here all these questions are being asked and discussed. So procedures and techniques are being tested. Eco-balance observations are going to be made. All the 4 technologies that I mentioned before are going to be assessed, and we are going to compare it with mechanical recycling and the energy recovery, the thermal recycling, to see or to lay down this ecological assessment to find out which method is maybe the best for plastics or suitable for plastics. And then as a next step, we will have to draw the political consequences. Well, that already brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm looking forward to the discussion later, and I think the day is very exciting. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vogel. Thank you for the first questions. No, we don't have questions of understanding for you, but there will be questions later on during the discussion. Thank you very much so far. So